Welcome to the second class of the module Old Norse Magic. Today's topic is the performers of rituals in pre-Christian Nordic religions. So the main objectives in this class would be to examine the sorcerers and sorceresses as both literary figures and potential historical characters at the same time, to evaluate the different categories of ritual specialists in their literary and historical context, as well as to investigate potential sorcerer graves. So we're also going to talk about material culture, the way literary sources can be reflected in material goods. Let us first discuss a few attributes of the god Odin, because Odin was not only the god of the elite, the aristocratic god, he was also a supernatural protector and a great sorcerer. He is always to be found on a quest for knowledge, and sometimes he does share this knowledge with his mortal subjects. And we can find a very good example here in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, because Egil loses a son at some point and he is very angry with Odin. However, he does realize that this has determined him to write some of the best poetry he had ever written, and he is very grateful for that. So you can see here in this example that Odin does bestow gifts on you, albeit at a very terrible price. A lot of Odin's magical attributes are presented in Ynglinga saga. That will be the first saga from the cycle Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson. Of course, this is not a straightforward explanation, and we should always remember that we are dealing with sources written in the High Middle Ages and the authors were Christian. However, if we look carefully through the material, we're going to find abilities which are also reflected in other sources, and they can also be intelligible in the context of shamanic attributes, for example. So some of these magical abilities include shape-shifting, spiritual traveling in animal form, very important communication with the world of the dead, as well as helping spirits and objects. And here we have, for example, the ravens Hugin and Munin. And if you are to separate Seidr in the very strict sense of binding from other forms of magic, Galdrar, which tends to involve some ritual chanting, or it is a magic oriented towards yourself, not the others. Here you can notice a great deal of examples involving divination, injuring, maiming, inflicting misfortune, as well as inducing weakness on the battlefield. But the clear distinction between Galdrar and Seidr is actually not that well defined. Galdrar seems to be one aspect of Seidr. At any rate, regardless of what he performs, this comes at a cost, the cost of shamefulness, the ergi. But within this particular activity, and especially if you're talking about the gods, you can notice a certain type of gender fluidity, so to speak. Other skills involve revealing the hidden or opening places such as burial mounds or mountains. So despite the fact that the source is a later one, you can actually notice a great deal of this dimension of sorcery in pretty much everything Odin does. For example, his ability to communicate in skaldic verse, the idea that poetry is a means of communication between humans and gods, and pretty much a supernatural power. The theme of acquiring supernatural power is clearly seen in the poem Hovamol, where Odin essentially sacrifices himself to himself, and he hangs on a tree for 9 nights, and then he falls and takes the runes and he learns 9 mighty songs. So he goes through this ecstatic ordeal just in order to gain the ability to cast spells. And he is also called the Lord of the Hanged. You can see this in skaldic poetry as well as on Gotlandic picture stones, where there is this image of a god among hanged people. And here you can think about the fact that death probably gave you access to secret knowledge, secret lore, and the god himself could only reach this knowledge by trying to, breach this boundary between life and death. Hence, not only does he have supernatural abilities as revealed in a myth such as the stealing of the mead of poetry and gaining superior knowledge in sacrificial acts or by communicating with the dead, but he also has the ability to create conflict and take the slain, and he needs the slain for his hall, for Valhall, because he's going to use them, the so-called Einherjar, in the battle, the apocalyptic battle at the end of the world in Ragnarok, in a desperate attempt to avoid his own fate. So whereas we are definitely dealing with a heroic mentality present in the way you would have perceived battle as a warrior, there would also have been a more sordid reality to it, reflected in the fact that everything happening on the battlefield would have been the gods' doing, in the sense that, for example, heroes that were explicitly honored by the god ended up slain on the battlefield. For example, Sigurd, Sigmund, and Sinfjotli, as well as Starkath. So in this sense, battle itself can be interpreted as one great sacrificial act, as the dead were offered to Odin. Overall, Odin seems very appealing to us as a character thanks to the experiences that defy the ordinary, because he poses into this great agent of inspiration, initiation, and at the same time destruction, pointing out towards a potential shamanistic interpretation. Ideas about soul journeying and shape-shifting, as well as entering a trance, we can find not only in the poem Hovamol, but also in the poem Grimnismol. In Grimnismol, he is made to stay for 9 days and 9 nights between 2 fires and without eating, and this experience results in him reciting a long list of magical and mythological knowledge. While this might not be shamanistic at all, it still induces the idea of increasing your spiritual power with the help of an extreme experience. His helping spirits reflect a combination of attributes related to the battlefield and of the supernatural. The ravens are an embodiment of his faculties, mind and memory, and his wolves, on the other hand, reflect this idea of beasts of the battle. Mimir's head is also something that often comes up. In the poem Sigurdrivumol, for example, Mimir's head is seen as one of the sources the god uses in order to gain knowledge of the runes. And in the poem Voluspo, it is said that he acquired wisdom by trading his eye for a drink from Mimir's well at the roots of the world tree. His names are also very suggestive. Odin actually comes from Other, meaning frenzy, so he is the mad god, the terrible god as well, as in Igr, and other names include references to war, wisdom, death, or shapeshifting. In the Ynglinga saga, we also find the very interesting information that Freya is actually the one who introduced Seidr magic to the Aesir family of the gods, to whom also Odin pertains, Freya being from the family of the Vanir gods, more often associated with ideas of fertility and prosperity. And this is actually the only kind of sorcery linked to Freya described in quite a negative manner as malevolent and very sexual. For example, if you read the poem Lokasena, you're going to find the insult Loki uses for the goddess Freya. He calls her a fordæða, which essentially means a witch. He says about her that she is mixed with evil, and he implies that she had a relationship to her own brother. Now, with regard to the family of the Vanir, this would have been something quite acceptable. Playing with sexual taboos of incest, for example, would have been also typical for Seidr, or at least in this Vanir dimension of it. After all, the associations with the negative charge of female sexuality might as well been a later development in the Middle Ages and not really specific to the Viking period. The Vanir attribute of fertility can be seen, for example, in the idea that the seers, the volva, or in plural the volur, were often asked to predict harvests, so prosperity for the community. We also have a couple of references regarding to prophecies being the will of Freyr or Freya, for example in Vatnsdæla saga, and in the poem Skirnismol, the servant of Freyr, Skirnir, appears to be using a staff in order to persuade, or better said, threaten the giantess Gerder to marry Freyr. Freya also has some interesting similarities to the god Odin, because she also performs shape-shifting and is considered a war deity, among other things. She appears in bird forms in several sources, and in the poem Grimnismol we read that she is the one actually choosing half of the slain every day. The importance of sorcery in the Viking world, in the Norse world, can also be inferred from a couple of aspects regarding Norse cosmogony, as depicted in the Eddic poems, at least in the Poetic Edda. Because here we find the information that the cosmos began with the so-called Ginnunga gap, which would mean the yawning void. And this concept seems to predate the 10th century, as suggested by a reference in a poem, in a skaldic poem known as the Haustlong, written by Theodulf of Hvínir. Now, the etymology is complex and it's quite unclear what the word actually meant. It's generally understood as symbolizing potential and creative power. And in the 30s, Jan de Vries suggested that the primal substance of Norse creation was to be found here in this void. So in the sense, perhaps it would be wrong to interpret it as a magical void or a void filled with magical powers. If sorcery was present at the birth of the cosmos, its practice appears to have been shaped by the nature of creation itself. Central to the Norse conception of the world was the great tree, the Yggdrasil, identified as an ash tree in the poem Grimnismol. It is mentioned in various sources. However, its etymology is intriguing, combining one of Odin's names, Ygr, with Drasil, meaning horse. So it appears to have meant Odin's horse. Therefore, it would have been portrayed as this very living, almost sentient entity at the center of the universe. And this idea of the tree as a horse, a vehicle for someone to traverse different worlds, actually is something that you're also going to find in circumpolar mythology. In Voluspoin stanza 2, the prophetess, the Volva, recalls 9 worlds which are associated or equivalent to the 9 wood giantesses, and that would be the roots of the world tree. These realms would most likely have been the realms of the dead. The exact geography of Hell and Niflhel, that would be the misty lands and the dark hell, remains quite unclear, but the poem Skirnismol mentions a realm of the dead, realm which has its roots below the corpse pens. And this is a phrase used to describe the location of hell in another poem, and the corpse pens might refer to graves or a fenced cemetery, the place from which the dead descend to their new home. In the poem of Vafthrudnismol, hell might refer to either the grave or the specific being with the same name guiding the dead to their appropriate realm among the 9 worlds. In Gylfaginning, which is Snorri's work, he places Niflhel as the lowest and most dreadful of the 9 worlds, and he suggests something worse further below, but then again the Christian influence is evident here. He perceives Niflhel as something distinct from the main realm of the dead. It is to be noted that the cosmology of the Eddic poems is not consistent at all. For example, are there 9 worlds in total, or are there 9 worlds of the dead? So there are multiple interpretations that appear as alternative to us. In Grimnismol, Yggdrasil has three roots under which dwell Hell, the giants, and the world of humans. Are these three groups clusters of the nine worlds, or how should we interpret that? The number nine is something that frequently appears in Norse mythology in magical formulas, in objects, levels of reality, and particularly in relation to sorcerers or supernatural beings with nine siblings and the 9 days or nights of ordeal in certain Odinic mysteries. There is also some evidence suggesting that the various worlds may rotate around the axis of the world tree, as indicated in Voluspor, and this is an idea also reflected in the concept of the cosmic millstone. Regardless, generally speaking, we are dealing with a world infused with magical powers, and there were some people with sufficient knowledge in order to navigate between these worlds and also gain access to even superior knowledge.